with all that said, I now want to focus on deconstructionism, and first I'll say, I remember seeing the video and seeing kind of the uproar that John Cooper from Skillet made, which is kind of strange to think about that, 20 some years ago, them being more goth inspired or whatever, sort of early in their career, it seemed to me that they were coming from something slightly more, I don't want to say progressive, but something more edgy, and then would seem in more recent years they're leaning very conservative. I'm not making any value statement. It's just kind of strange, is all I know to say concerning that specifically. But, look, I understand to an extent, I guess, where he's coming from. I just don't think that was a good idea to, condemn it from stage and declare war against it. I just don't see that as being very productive. And then, the way he came across with it, it just sort of made me wonder, do you really actually know what you're talking about here? Or you're just getting into some sort of emotional tangent? I don't know. I haven't kept up with any of that recently. It just, it just seemed really strange to me and kind of counterproductive. When it comes to deconstruction and critical thinking in general, I went through that phase, did that before it, I did it before it became a popular thing to do. It was a method in many respects, and it put me at odds, not just with, my opponents, but often with allies as well. It was a critique, but not just against my opponents, but against myself in my own biases, and even a critique against my own critique, perhaps. So I was willing to listen to anyone and everyone and deal with, whoever, and not demonize others' viewpoints, or maybe even more so, not demonize the individual for having their beliefs, but rather, I think for me, it was more about the particular behaviors and attitudes that came from those belief systems. And so, for example, in my college years, I think is where a lot of that kind of deconstruction initially began. I mean, it was years long process. I remember going through humanities classes and all these just classes in general, where the professor seemed to want to indoctrinate us in not becoming postmodern. But I remember sitting, over dinner one night with some, acquaintances really, and us talking about postmodernism, and all of us sort of realizing that, like, we didn't take postmodernism to the most extreme extremes, but that in trying to convince us that postmodernism is the evil and downfall of this society, you know, which was what some of our professors were trying to, indoctrinate us with. In trying to do that, they sort of made us more postmodern, um, in that, like, I think we all agreed that there was absolute truth, is absolute truth, and that there is such thing as reality itself, that objective reality, that there is objectivity, um, but that I think we came to conclusion, this was like my fourth year of college, that a lot of what people were trying to say was objective truth was really just subjective truth. That a lot of people, especially with like their political ideologies, were trying to make it into some objective Christian truth where in fact it wasn't at all. So, like, it got to the point where I never questioned whether or not a Christian could still be a Republican or a Democrat. I was listening to, you know, these like Scandinavian Christian hardcore bands that were like outright socialists, and they had no, like Blindside in particular. I remember seeing a interview where they were talking about, being socialists and all because, they were from Scandinavia. But likewise, saying, yeah, we think, Jesus, embodied a lot of socialist ideals. And so, we have no problem saying we're socialists or whatever. And then they move on in the conversation, not make this huge deal out of it. And, I respected that. Um, you know, but at the same time, it's like, well, is that, well, Jesus was a socialist. Can't convince me of that because socialism didn't exist back then. And if anything, it would seem that he was kind of apolitical in a lot of ways while like respecting, you know, the governments to, Roman law, taxation, stuff like that, to, wasn't telling people don't pay your taxes, opposite is true. So, yeah, I got to the place where I didn't question whether somebody could be because like at my university, it was very much, you're supposed to be very conservative, and I had friends who were openly Democrats and still Christians, and it was like, well, of course you can be a Democrat and be a Christian. Why? Like, who made that rule? Nobody, except the groupthink within those environments. And it just got to the place where it made no sense to me anymore. Um, So I didn't question that, but rather the behaviors, if they reflected the fruits of the Spirit, or if their views caused them to subjugate others, and not just like literal or financial subjugation, but emotionally, psychologically, with groupthink or whatever, I started to question that. And so for me, the questions dealing with, I guess, deconstruction had more to do with human nature rather than, the invented systems or whatever. And so when dealing with systems, it was through the lens of human nature and mankind's corruption. And it caused me a lot of self-reflection and being aware of myself. And my point now is why critical thinking and deconstruction irks me, because it, to me, has become a worldview to itself. And maybe that's what John Cooper was trying to convey, though very poorly. Nowadays, it's a popular thing to do, and kind of gets you social brownie points, in my opinion. And it's become popular to demonize the opposition for the beliefs they have themselves. And it's like deconstruction becomes not a means towards truth, but it becomes the end itself. And so with that comes, virtue signaling and a subsequent, martyr complex that goes, that comes when, I guess, like the status quo opposes them. Whereas back in the day, 10, 15 years ago, when it wasn't popular, it wasn't about virtue signaling, but making a stand for, what I believed in for itself. And even when it put me in opposition to everyone around me, even people who would say they, I guess, agreed with a lot of my claims. And it made me feel back then that, I was standing alone, but that was okay to, stand alone. Nowadays, deconstructionists who hold it more as a worldview, they tend to, in my opinion, only perpetuate the very culture war that they're supposed to be against in the first place. Which I do think I did some of that back in the day, but I came to realize it over time, and hence the, self-critique and self-awareness that comes with it. And even then, I don't think I was quite as vocal. It was giving some, very public critiques, but I still viewed it as through a lens of critiquing human nature rather than just systems or whatever themselves. So positions that are, more fundamentalistic in nature really haven't changed all that much at all over the years. And I guess that kind of goes in with, the very definition of fundamentalism. But meanwhile, like, more progressive positions have evolved tremendously, beyond the scope of anything I ever imagined back then. So that means that the culture war itself has evolved. But back then, 10, 15 years ago, it seemed like it was a battle for Christian dominance. And fundamentalists, I think, especially like this was true of. Um, but the way I see it, it's become something else entirely and not indicative of religion per se. That the culture war could be against, pedagogy itself, or against individuality and the right to think out towards, one's own conclusions. So, for example, the phrase "no justice, no peace." Well, sure, it's a true statement, yet many of those stating that truth are willing to become warmongers in the process. That that being like so many among the left, especially, are quick to condemn others' violence as these abstract concepts rather than physical acts. Yet they themselves are willing to cancel and create violence themselves against those with differing ideologies. I mean, I knew a guy that, you know, he used to be a teacher or something in a social circle that I was sort of in the fringes of, and he quit teaching, took this other job or whatever. And I remember in the middle of the pandemic seeing it pop up on like my Facebook wall, him making these comments and like trolling, very fundamentalistic people and conservatives, and like calling people to, like troll bomb this person's wall and cancel them. And actually, I saw that kind of from a couple of people, and I'm like, this has nothing to do with you being more of a progressive ideology, but like you're just being a straight up bully and hiding behind your political ideology as being this moralistic good thing, and it's just absolutely crazy to me. And so that's what I wanted to deal with in writing this song is, I understand to an extent going through whatever degree of deconstruction, but at the end of the day, you've got to reconstruct something. You know, for a lot of people, they move on into, reconstructing their faith. For a lot of other people, it's they, what's the word I want to use for it's they, it's not deconstruction, it's just deconversion. Um, and, very, very early on, it was, and of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, the initial choice for me was deconversion or deconstruction, and they're two completely different things. But it was going to the foundation of, well, do I believe in this Jesus Christ person? Do I believe he's the Son of God? And then moving on from there, and that was at the very foundation of faith. That's where you have to start. But in my opinion, a lot of people are starting from the top and going down, and I just don't think that's necessarily a productive way of going about things. Um, Plus, that this is something that takes years in going through and processing, religious, emotional, psychological, maybe physical, in some cases, sexual trauma and stuff like that. And it just takes years. But it's like people just, it's almost like they were supposed to arrive instantaneously. And it was just very confusing to me and still is. So the references that I want to point out here, the title Vox Ignis is Latin for voice of fire, but could also mean voice of the people as well. And it was a word, a phrase that I actually stole from X-Men related comic book series in the last year or so. Um, it's the name of this like character. It's basically Banshee from the X-Men with one of the like spirits of vengeance. So it's kind of like Banshee becomes Ghost Rider, sort of. Anyways, there's a phrase I use with justice negated, and that references, no justice, no peace. And its exact meaning was contested to one of three things: that there is no peace because there is no justice, that there will be no peace until there is justice, or if there is no justice, there is no peace. So I personally think there is at least another meaning implied by, the phrase no justice, no peace. And that would be, if you act with no justice, we will act with no peace. And to me, that fourth option sort of became more of what the implication was going on within our society. So then there's a reference to life, liberty, and property in the song. That's, you know, the Constitution kind of reference there, which I've probably used this reference before. I think it's an interesting one that it's written into our Constitution as a country, with the exception being that it's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, whereas what this is actually referencing is who the constitutional writers were referencing, which was the philosopher John Locke, who said life, liberty, and property. Then there's a line that says, control the narrative, control the image, which was a phrase that I took from listening to a podcast called The Gangster Capitalist. And that just control the narrative, control the image seemed like a really strange, I don't know how to explain it. It's strange and it kind of sounds icky to me. Then there's the experiencing self versus the remembering nostalgic self of youth that I reference. And this was something I saw in an article from a person named Kahneman. And it's saying that like psychologically there is two versions of people, the person, experiencing the moment, and then the person who is, remembering who they are in, past eras of time. I reference the Battle of the Bastards, which is obviously from Game of Thrones. There's a section where I think it was the Black Knight talks about dealing with his own fundamentalism. And I took this idea from an interview. One of the podcasts that I sort of keep current with is called the Growing Up Christian podcast. And a year or two ago, they were interviewing this guy named Aaron Lunsford, who was the drummer for this, post-hardcore Christian band called As Cities Burn, and he's also one of the commentators or whatever for the Bad Christian podcast. For those of you who are aware of that podcast and what it's become in the last year or so. Which is called Songs and Stories, and he's still a regular on there. But he was basically on there making fun of Christian Twitter, and the deconstruction side of Twitter, by saying something like, "Oh yeah, a couple of years ago you were at some Christian college or graduated from YWAM or whatever, and now you're the protector of the downtrodden." Yeah, that makes sense. And it made me laugh. I was like, yeah, that's a pretty good point. And so, he was saying that his whole thing, many of those people on Christian Twitter, especially, that, he used to kind of troll them, even though he would consider himself as sort of a deconstructionist himself. But his problem was that these people still hadn't dealt with their own fundamentalism inside them. That really, what was once, conservative fundamentalism only became left-leaning fundamentalism. That it was fundamentalism applied, but towards the opposite end of the political perspective. And so, his whole point was these people aren't dealing with their own baggage. And, this was a critique coming from a guy himself who, was stating, that he was very far from being considered a conservative at all. And so, him saying that made a lot of sense to me. And then going into the story and everything, was reference to, wearing armor 10 sizes too big, the Black Knight stating that. And this was from an article that I read, and I think it was Psychology Today or something, but this was back when I was in college, so it's been 16, 17, 18 maybe years since I saw this article, and I've probably referenced it in this in my music before, perhaps. I can't remember. I know I've written about it in my novels and all. But I was sitting in my physician's office, waiting in the waiting area, and picked up this article. And it was probably around my fourth year of college. So, this was back in 2006. And it was an article that's stuck with me ever since. And, looking back now, it's not even that big of a deal, but at the time it was something that I hadn't really thought as much about. And so the article was saying, that for men in particular, we tend to wear these pieces of armor that are 10 sizes too big for us, and yet our biggest fear is that a woman will look down inside beneath the armor and see the frail boy that we really are, see our true weaknesses and all. And so that's what the Black Knight does in this song, but not to a woman or a lover or anything like that, but to the protagonist. as a friend and compatriot, because they're both just dudes. And so it ties in with the meaning of what's going on in this song of, the answer being, you need to open up your armor. And I think that also is one of the things that those in deconstruction phases need to do in their own lives, is to be willing to shut up for a second, honestly, to take a step back and sure, critique what's going on out here, that's fine, but first and foremost, to be able to critique yourself and be able to take the time to do so without having to go out and become a social justice warrior. I just don't see that as being a healthy thing to do when you're still dealing with some idea of fundamentalism. And, it took me years to deal with that. And, depending on who you ask, I may still be dealing with a lot of that stuff, and that's okay. Like, it takes time. But like, being okay to say that, like, this is a long-term process, I think it is a wise decision, a wise step. And in the process of that, being able to open yourself up and be vulnerable with other people. And obviously, that is something, that needs to be done wisely as well. You just don't open your armor up to every single person you come across. But being able to be vulnerable around people you truly trust, whether it's family, your closest friends, a pastor, whoever. But, being able to take that time to be vulnerable is extremely important, and to do it wisely as individuals, and not just trying to do it publicly in order to show yourself as a moral person. Like, that's just not productive. Sorry, not sorry. It's just not. And so that's what I wanted to deal with in this song specifically. And I'm gonna read the last lines of this song and leave you with this, because it comes into play in the next song, and I want y'all to keep this in mind, that the Black Knight says this: yours is a bastard's battle with no need to forcing your way. I once desired becoming a general, but you can have its regalia. And that's kind of my attitude when it comes to this stuff, is being able to say, like, you're only perpetuating a war, and I think it's just better off to not virtue signal and not become a general in some social and cultural war. It's, you just have to deal with this stuff individually. But yeah, keep that last line in mind, because it's going to become very important tomorrow. So until then.